Not long ago, Microsoft shut down 5 Xbox studios and fired thousands of developers. At the same time, over 3,000 union members stood outside demanding the same thing workers demanded 10 years ago, and 20 years before that, reasonable hours. The industry calls it crunch, sustained overtime, sometimes for months, sometimes for years, treated as the normal cost of shipping a game. Journalist Jason Schreier spent a decade documenting it, one studio at a time, in blood, sweat, and pixels, and dozens of investigations since. The pattern he found repeats with almost no variation. Ambitious game, shrinking timeline, then a studio quietly asks its people to disappear into the office for months. Here is how that pattern actually plays out, studio by studio, and why the fight to end it just collided with something bigger. A standard game industry week runs 40 hours. Crunch adds 20, 40, sometimes 60 more on top, for weeks at a stretch before a deadline. The 2026 State of the Game Industry Survey polled over 2,300 professionals. 28% said they went through a layoff in the past 2 years. 62% said they would vote for a union if given the chance. Those two numbers sit next to each other for a reason. Crunch and job insecurity feed the same fear. Work the extra hours or someone replaces you. Ship on time or the studio closes. Management rarely calls it crunch in public. Internally, teams call it the final push, the sprint, the polish phase. Whatever the name, the paycheck stays the same and only the hours change. Red Dead Redemption 2 shipped with 300,000 animations and 500,000 lines of dialogue. Weeks before launch, Rockstar co-founder Dan Houser told a reporter his team worked 100-hour weeks multiple times that year. The quote spread everywhere within a day. Houser walked it back fast, saying he meant a 4-person senior writing team doing 3 intense weeks after 7 years on the project, not the whole studio. He called the extra hours a choice. The walkback changed nothing for people who remembered 2010. Back then, spouses of Rockstar San Diego employees wrote an open letter describing 12-hour average days and mandatory Saturdays during the first Red Dead Redemption. The studio had heard this complaint before Houser ever gave that interview. Whether 100-hour weeks belonged to 4 writers or 400 developers, the industry treated the number as proof of something everyone already knew. Inside BioWare, veterans had a phrase for their process: BioWare magic. No matter how broken a game looked in mid-development, the belief was that everything would click into place in the final months, and that definitely happened with Dragon Age and Mass Effect. Anthem sat in pre-production for 4 years with no clear direction. When an EA executive finally saw a demo, he called it unacceptable. The studio responded with 6 weeks of crunch just to build something better for one meeting. That set the tone for the rest of development. The game shipped to a Metacritic score of 59. Developers who spoke to journalist Jason Schreier described something they started calling a stress casualty, a coworker who vanished for 1 to 3 months after a mental health breakdown, then sometimes came back, sometimes didn't. The magic that saved every previous BioWare project never arrived for this one. 19 people told Schreier the same story from 19 different angles. CD Projekt Red built its reputation on The Witcher 3, a game finished under the same overtime pressure everyone else in the industry used. In 2019, co-founder Marcin Nowinski told reporters the studio would do better on Cyberpunk 2077, that crunch would stay optional and nobody would be forced. 6 weeks before launch, studio head Adam Badowski sent an internal email making 6-day weeks mandatory for the entire studio. His own message admitted the contradiction. This is in direct opposition to what we've said about crunch, and to what I personally believe. Polish labor law meant every hour got paid, and the studio later split 10% of that year's profit among the team as a gesture. In 2011, after Uncharted 3, creative director Amy Hennig called that project the hardest thing she'd ever done in the industry. In 2018, during Uncharted 4, 70% of the game's non-lead designers left the studio before the credits even finished rolling. In 2020, journalist Jason Schreier reported 12-hour days across The Last of Us Part 2, with some developers privately hoping the game would fail just to prove the workload wasn't sustainable. It won Game of the Year anyway. After that, Naughty Dog said it was changing. A 2020 documentary about the game's development showed the studio pledging to fix its production culture. In 2022, one environment artist said publicly that for the first time in 13 years at the studio, he shipped a game without crunching. Then, in December 2025, Bloomberg reported the studio's next project, Intergalactic, had fallen back into the same 12-hour rhythm. The producers hired specifically to prevent it had mostly already left. A former senior designer explained the mechanism plainly. Internal deadlines get treated with the same weight as a publisher's real ones, so every milestone becomes a crisis whether or not it needs to be. Quality assurance testers at Raven Software formed the first union inside Activision Blizzard in January 2022. By August 2025, they had a contract eliminating mandatory crunch outright. 7 days notice for any overtime, no back-to-back overtime weeks, no exceptions. ZeniMax workers signed a similar deal in June 2025. Blizzard's own QA staff in Albany and Austin ratified theirs in January 2026, adding limits on how AI tools get used against their jobs. On paper, 2026 looks like the year the crunch started losing. Then, on July 6th, Microsoft closed 5 Xbox studios and laid off thousands of people in a single announcement, days after over 3,500 union members publicly demanded layoff protections the company had left unanswered for months. Microsoft posted $32 billion in quarterly profit, the same period Xbox's own content revenue fell 5%. The company wasn't losing money. Xbox was losing the argument for why it needed as many people as it had. Crunch and layoffs used to look like opposite problems. Work them too hard or don't need them at all. In 2026, they're the same fight, argued in the same press conferences, against the same employer. Every story here shares one root cause: a production plan that assumed the wrong amount of time, discovered late, and fixed with human hours instead of a schedule change. A prototype tested in the first 2 months catches a broken idea before it becomes a crisis. A studio that brings in outside production capacity before the deadline panic starts never needs to ask its own people for a 100-hour week. Kavuru Games builds prototypes in 1 to 2 months and provides co-development and outstaffing support for studios that need real production capacity at the moment the schedule gets tight, not after.